The Mariana Explorer's hull creaked under pressure as I guided her deeper into the Tonga Trench. At 5,000 feet, the darkness outside the viewport was absolute, broken only by the cone of light from my external floods. This was supposed to be routine. Another day. Another deep-sea survey. But even after hundreds of dives, I never took the crushing depths for granted. Systems check, I muttered to myself, running through my mental checklist. The cramped cockpit of the submersible was filled with the soft hum of equipment and the occasional ping from the sonar. I tapped the oxygen readout, watching the numbers hold steady at 98%. Good. I had enough air for 12 hours, though this mission was only scheduled for 6. The backup systems were all operational, and the primary life support was functioning within normal parameters. I adjusted my position in the pilot's seat, feeling the familiar contours press against my back. The Explorer wasn't built for comfort. She was built to keep me alive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Communications check, Jordan. Do you read? I spoke into my headset, keeping my eyes on the depth gauge as it ticked steadily downward. 5,212 feet. 5,213. After a brief crackle of static, Jordan's voice came through, clear and professional. Reading you 5x5, Sully. How's visibility down there? Limited. Can't see more than 30 feet in any direction. I adjusted the external lights, sweeping them across the endless blue-black water. But sonar's picking up the trench walls right where they should be. Topography matches the charts. Copy that. Continue your descent to the target depth. Any signs of marine life? I watched a small school of deep-sea fish dart through my lights, their pale bodies almost translucent. Just the usual suspects. Some fish, probably viperfish based on their profile. Nothing remarkable. The submersible continued its descent, the hull occasionally making small adjustment noises as the pressure increased. I kept my hand steady on the controls, making minor course corrections. This part of the job was mostly waiting and watching, staying alert for anything unusual. Passing 5,500 feet, I reported. All systems nominal. Beginning first survey pattern once I reach 6,000. Copy that, Jordan replied. Weather topside is holding steady. No concerns from our end. I didn't respond immediately, my attention caught by something on the sonar display. A series of irregular returns had appeared at the edge of my detection range, too organized to be natural formations. Jordan, I'm picking up what looks like scattered debris about a quarter mile ahead. Adjusting course to investigate. That's not on our charts, she said, her tone sharpening with interest. Can you get a visual? Not yet. I'll let you know when I'm closer. I nudged the Explorer forward, watching the depth gauge pass 5,800 feet. The pressure outside was now approaching 2,600 pounds per square inch, enough to crush an unpressurized human body instantly. The thought didn't bother me anymore. It was just part of the job. As I approached 6,000 feet, my external lights finally caught the edge of what had registered on sonar. Metal glinted in the artificial light, unmistakably man-made. I've got a visual on the debris field, I said, feeling my pulse quicken. Discoveries like this were why I did this job. It's definitely artificial. Looks like a... Wait a minute. I slowed the Explorer's approach, carefully maneuvering between larger pieces of debris. And then I saw it, the curved hull of a submarine, partially buried in silt, but remarkably intact for something that had sunk to these depths. Jordan, are you seeing this? I asked, activating the external cameras to record everything. Feed's coming through now, she confirmed, excitement creeping into her voice. Can you identify it? I carefully piloted closer, sweeping my lights across the wreckage. The design was distinctive, long and sleek with an unusual configuration. I believe we're looking at a Japanese I-400 class submarine, I said, unable to keep the excitement from my voice. Hull is mostly intact. This is incredible. There were only 3 ever built. They were the largest submarines in the world until the nuclear era. Are you serious? Jordan's professional tone momentarily broke. That's a major historical find, Sully. I'm dead serious. And from what I can see, this one is in remarkable condition. I guided the explorer in a slow circle around the wreck, keeping a respectful distance. The pressure down here and low oxygen content must have preserved it. I activated additional camera systems, making sure to document every angle of the submarine. This kind of find could be career-making, not just for me, but for the entire research team. I'm recording everything, I assured Jordan, going to make another pass around the stern. As I carefully piloted around the massive wreck, I noticed something unusual on my sonar display. A large contact had appeared at the edge of my detection range, and it was moving. Jordan, I'm picking up something big on sonar, I said, frowning at the display. Too big to be typical deep-sea fauna for this depth. How big are we talking? She asked. I watched the contact, trying to make sense of the readings. Big. And it's moving fast. Faster than anything should be able to move down here. The contact was approaching my position rapidly, which made no sense. Large marine life at this depth typically moved slowly to conserve energy. This was different. I'm going to back off from the wreck, I said, already pulling away. Something doesn't feel right. Before Jordan could respond, something slammed into the Explorer with tremendous force. The impact threw me against my harness as the submersible spun violently. Warning lights flashed across the control panel as multiple systems registered damage. "Mayday! Mayday!" I shouted into my comm. "I've been hit by something. The Explorer is in an uncontrolled spin." I fought with the controls, trying to stabilize the vessel as it tumbled through the water. More warning lights flashed. Hull integrity was holding, but the external ballast system had been damaged. One of the thrusters was offline. "Jordan, do you copy?" I yelled, but only static answered me. The communications array must have been damaged in the impact. I managed to engage the emergency stabilization system, finally bringing the Explorer's wild spin under control. My hands flew across the controls, running diagnostics and assessing the damage. We were built to withstand pressure, not impacts. If the hull had been compromised even slightly. Movement outside the viewport caught my attention. I looked up, and what I saw froze the blood in my veins. Through the clear acrylic, illuminated by my external lights, was a creature that shouldn't exist. Massive flipper-like limbs propelled it through the water, with impossible grace for its size. But it was the head that made me doubt my own sanity. A crocodilian shape, easily 8 feet long, with rows of teeth visible as it opened its jaws. The creature circled the Explorer, moving with deliberate, predatory precision. It wasn't mindlessly attacking. It was studying the submersible, its eyes reflecting my lights with calculating intelligence. This wasn't random marine life. This was something else entirely, something that looked like it had swam straight out of the Mesozoic era. The thing in front of me shouldn't exist. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature as it circled the Mariana Explorer, its massive body moving with surprising grace through the pitch-black water. Every bit of my 15 years working. The deep told me what I was seeing was impossible. "That's a damn pliosaur," I muttered to myself, the words sounding absurd even as they left my mouth. I'd seen the fossils in museums, those ancient marine reptiles with powerful flippers and elongated crocodile-like heads that had no business being alive 100 million years after their extinction. Yet here it was, at least 30 feet long, circling my damaged submersible at 6,000 feet below the Pacific. I snapped back to reality and turned to the communications panel, flipping switches and adjusting dials. Jordan? Jordan, do you copy? This is Sully. I have an emergency situation. Nothing but static answered me. Pacific Salvage Operations. This is Mariana Explorer declaring an emergency. Does anyone read me? The radio hissed uselessly. Whatever had happened during that impact had knocked out our connection to the surface. I was completely alone down here. A shadow passed across the viewport, and I jerked my head up to see the creature gliding by again, one massive eye fixed on the Explorer. Then it vanished into the darkness beyond my lights. "This isn't happening," I said, but the warning lights on my control panel argued otherwise. I ran through a systems diagnostic, trying to focus on the immediate threats rather than the impossible predator outside. The collision had damaged more than just communications. The main drive was struggling, power fluctuating between 60 and 40% capacity. If it failed completely, I'd have no way to maneuver. A flashing red indicator caught my eye and my stomach dropped. The external ballast system was compromised. I checked the depth gauge, 6,100 feet, 6,120, 6,135. We were sinking. In a submersible, that's about the worst news possible short of a hull breach. I was already well beyond the crush depth of most vessels. The Mariana Explorer was cutting edge, rated for 8,000 feet, but that assumed all systems were functioning properly. The creature appeared again, swimming directly at the viewport before veering away at the last second. It wasn't random movement. It was testing the submersible, looking for weaknesses. Just like a modern predator would. I reached for the emergency protocols manual strapped to the side of my console, though I knew most of it by heart. I activated the backup ballast system, which should have stabilized our depth, but the gauge continued its steady descent. 6,250 feet. "Come on," I urged the struggling system. The backup wasn't stopping our descent, only slowing it. I did some quick mental math. At our current rate of descent, I had maybe 2 hours before we hit the Explorer's maximum rated depth. After that, the pressure would start doing things to the hull that I didn't want to think about. The main drive sputtered, and the submersible lurched to the side. I grabbed the controls, fighting to keep us level. That's when I saw it again. The creature hanging in the water about 20 feet away, watching with predatory patience. Its body was massive, with 4 powerful flipper-like limbs that propelled it through the water with frightening speed. The head was at least 6 feet long, filled with teeth I could see clearly even at this distance. Conical, interlocking daggers designed for catching and holding prey. Prey like me. But it was the eyes that got to me. They weren't the dull, mindless eyes of a fish. They tracked the Explorer with calculated intelligence, the kind that comes with being at the top of the food chain. The creature circled again, then suddenly disappeared into the darkness beyond my lights. I took the moment to check all systems again, looking for anything that might help. Primary drive, damaged, operating at 35% capacity communications, offline ballast system, compromised backup ballast, operating but insufficient life support, nominal, 10 hours remaining, depth, 6,385 feet and increasing hull integrity, holding at 92%. I wasn't in immediate danger of imploding, but the trajectory was clear. Without finding a way to stop our descent or repair the ballast system, this situation had only one outcome. The depth gauge clicked over to 6,500 feet. I'd never been this deep before, not in any submersible. Few people had. The pressure outside was approaching 3 tons per square inch, enough to crush a human body to the size of a soda can in milliseconds if the hull failed. I tried the radio again, adjusting frequencies and power settings, hoping for even the faintest response. Nothing but static. A heavy impact rocked the Explorer, sending tools and equipment flying across the cabin. I grabbed the edge of the console to steady myself as alarms blared throughout the cockpit. Hull integrity at 89%, the automated system announced in its emotionless voice. The creature had rammed us again, harder this time. I caught a glimpse of it through the viewport as it circled back around. It was testing different spots on the hull, methodically probing for weaknesses. "You're a patient bastard, aren't you?" I said to the empty cabin. That was the truly terrifying part. This wasn't mindless aggression. The creature was hunting with intelligence, waiting for the Explorer to weaken, knowing we were sinking deeper. It had all the time in the world. I'd seen sharks do similar things to disabled boats on the surface, but this was different, more calculated, more precise. This was apex predator behavior from something that should have been extinct when the dinosaurs were. I tried another emergency protocol, attempting to seal off sections of the ballast system that might be damaged. The descent slowed slightly but didn't stop. We passed 6,600 feet. The emergency manual offered few options for my situation. Most emergency protocols assumed you could communicate with the surface, or at least drop ballast to rise. With my ballast tanks compromised, jettisoning them wouldn't help. They were already full of water. I could try to land the Explorer on the ocean floor, but we were still at least 2,000 feet above the bottom of the trench. The hull would likely fail long before we reached it. Another impact, this time from below. The creature was getting more aggressive, or maybe just more confident. Hull integrity at 85%, the system reported. I knew the brutal truth of deep-sea physics. Every 100 feet deeper added crushing pressure to the already stressed hull. Even without the creature's attacks, the increasing depth alone would eventually compromise the Explorer's structure. Water under this kind of pressure doesn't just leak in. It explodes inward through even the smallest breach, slicing through everything in its path. I'd seen the aftermath once, years ago, when they recovered what was left of the Hermes 2. There hadn't been much. I scanned the cockpit for anything that might help. Emergency flares wouldn't work at this depth. The distress beacon was tied to the communications system, which was dead. The Explorer carried a small toolkit for minor repairs, but nothing that could fix damaged ballast tanks from inside the vessel. The depth gauge read 6,700 feet now. My options were running out. The creature appeared again, swimming a tight circle around the Explorer. Its movement seemed more excited now, as if it sensed its prey was weakening. It rammed the hull once more, sending a shudder through the entire vessel. The impact was followed by a metallic groan that reverberated through the structure, the sound of steel under stress. Hull integrity at 82%, the system announced. I tried every emergency protocol I could think of. I rerouted power, tried to patch through to different communication channels, and attempted to balance the remaining functional ballast cells to slow our descent. Nothing worked well enough to change the outcome, only to delay it. As I watched the depth gauge click past 6,800 feet, I faced the harsh truth. Without a solution, the Mariana Explorer would continue sinking until the increasing pressure crushed the hull. The depth gauge clicked past 7,000 feet. I stared at the numbers, watching them climb higher with each passing minute. Every inch downward added more crushing weight to the Explorer's hull, which made its protest known through a chorus of groans and metallic pops that echoed through the cabin. I wiped sweat from my brow, ignoring the tremor in my hand. The cold reality of my situation settled in my gut like a lead weight. At this depth, the pressure outside exceeded 3,000 pounds per square inch, enough to flatten a car like a soda can. I'd spent 15 years in deep-sea operations, but never had I faced a situation this dire without surface contact. The control panel in front of me displayed a sea of red warning indicators. The hull integrity had dropped to 79%. Still holding, but for how long? I took a deep breath and forced my mind to work the problem methodically. Panic would only speed up my death. I pulled up the emergency protocols on the main screen, scanning through options I'd already considered. Most were useless in my current situation, designed for mechanical failures, not prehistoric sea monsters. But there had to be something I could use. Think, damn it, I muttered to myself, my voice sounding strange in the confined space. A shadow passed over the viewport. I looked up to see the creature gliding by again, its massive body blocking what little light my external floods cast into the abyss. I'd started calling it a pliosaur in my head, the closest match to what I'd learned about prehistoric marine reptiles years ago. But this thing was unlike anything in the fossil record I knew of. It was larger, more agile, and displayed behavior that seemed calculated. I watched its movement on the external camera feeds. Despite the damage to some systems, 3 cameras were still operational, giving me a partial view of my surroundings. The creature wasn't just circling randomly, it was swimming in a distinct pattern, keeping a consistent distance from the explorer while gradually closing in. Like a shark, but with what seemed like strategy behind its movements. The sonar pinged, tracking the creature's position. I studied its movement pattern, noting how it maintained a specific distance before cutting in closer, then retreating, testing my responses. This wasn't mindless predatory behavior. This thing was hunting with intelligence. I recalled reading somewhere that pliosaurs, like modern marine reptiles, would need to surface for air. But that thought gave me little comfort. At over a mile beneath the ocean's surface, I'd be crushed long before this thing needed its next breath. The depth gauge now read 7,050 feet. I turned my attention back to the emergency systems list, scrolling through options until something caught my eye. Emergency ejection system. Status. Operational. My heart jumped. The Explorer was equipped with a self-contained escape pod, essentially the cockpit section designed to detach from the main body and rocket to the surface in case of catastrophic failure. I'd never had to use one before, but I knew the theory. The pod would seal off from the main vessel, jettison with compressed air, and then use a series of small thrusters to control its ascent. I pulled up the ejection system diagnostics. The pod's power cells showed 100% charge, and all separation mechanisms appeared functional. This was my lifeline, a way out of this nightmare. But a new worry formed. The ejection system was designed for mechanical emergencies, not evasion. The pod would rise at a maximum speed of about 40 feet per second, fast by underwater standards, but would it outpace the creature? I had no data on how quickly this prehistoric hunter could swim, but its movements so far suggested remarkable speed for its size. If I ejected and it gave chase, I'd be even more vulnerable in the smaller pod with fewer options for defense. Defense. The word triggered a thought, and I switched screens to check the status of the Explorer's external tools. Most deep-sea vehicles carried various attachments for their missions. The Explorer was outfitted for salvage operations, which meant... Yes, I said aloud as I confirmed what I was hoping for. The salvage harpoons were still responsive. These weren't weapons in the traditional sense. They were titanium spears designed to secure underwater debris or attached to sunken vessels during recovery operations. But they were mounted on hydraulic arms that could extend and retract, and they could penetrate thick metal. Against organic matter, they would be deadly. I ran a quick diagnostic on the harpoon system. 2 of the 4 harpoons were operational, with full hydraulic pressure. The targeting system was tied to the external cameras, allowing for precision placement. I'd used them dozens of times to secure salvage, but never against a living target. The creature swam into view of the port camera, and I got my first clear look at it since the initial attack. What I saw sent ice through my veins. Its body was massive, at least 30 feet long, with powerful flipper-like limbs that propelled it through the water with surprising grace. Its skin was a mottled gray-green, textured with what looked like armored scales along its back. But it was the creature's head that held my attention. The elongated jaw was lined with teeth the size of combat knives, some broken or chipped. Deep scars ran along its flanks, evidence of ancient battles with other ocean predators. This thing had been fighting and surviving in these depths for who knows how long. As it turned toward the camera, I saw its eye, black and cold, but with something behind it that I recognized immediately. Intelligence. Not just animal instinct, but calculating awareness. It knew I was watching it, and it seemed to be watching me back. "What the hell are you?" I whispered. The depth gauge now read 7,120 feet. I turned my attention to communications once more. Jordan and the surface team would be looking for me by now, but without a signal, they wouldn't know where to start. The Explorer's emergency beacon was designed to activate automatically in case of system failure, but the attack had damaged the main antenna. I accessed the power distribution controls and made a decision. Life support was my priority, but I could divert energy from non-essential systems to boost the emergency signal. I shut down the cabin heating system, keeping only the minimal environmental controls running, and redirected that power to the backup communications array. The cabin temperature would drop, but my survival suit would keep me warm enough. I typed in the commands and executed the power transfer. The emergency signal strength increased from 20% to 65%, still not ideal, but a significant improvement. If any rescue vessels were in range, they might pick it up. I keyed the microphone again. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Mariana Explorer at depth 7,120 feet and descending. Hull compromised. Systems failing. Large marine predator present and hostile. Request immediate assistance." I transmitted on all frequencies, but heard only static in return. The water density and depth made radio communication nearly impossible without relay buoys, which had likely been damaged in the initial attack. The depth gauge clicked over to 7,200 feet. Almost on cue, the creature's behavior changed. Through the external cameras, I watched it abandon its circling pattern and dart toward the Explorer with frightening speed. It pulled back at the last second, but the message was clear. Its patience was running out. The next pass brought it closer to the hull, its massive body brushing against the outer shell. The impact sent vibrations through the cabin, and another warning light flashed on the console as the hull integrity dropped to 76%. The creature was done testing. It was starting its final attack. I positioned my hands over the control panels, left hand over the harpoon targeting system, right hand hovering above the ejection system controls. Both were last resorts, and both carried serious risks. The harpoons might anger the creature further if they didn't kill it outright. The ejection system would leave me in a smaller, more vulnerable pod with limited power and oxygen. But I was out of options and nearly out of time. The creature lined up for another pass, this time coming straight for the viewport. I had seconds to make my choice. My fingers tensed over the controls as the massive jaws opened wide, revealing rows of teeth designed to shred through flesh and bone. Those ancient eyes locked with mine through the reinforced glass, predator to prey, as it closed the final distance. The creature hit the Explorer like a freight train. I'd barely moved my hand toward the harpoon controls when those massive jaws clamped onto the forward section of the hull. The impact knocked me sideways, my shoulder smacking against the control panel. A horrible screeching sound filled the cabin, metal giving way under thousands of pounds of bite force. Red warning lights flashed across every screen as the pressure breach alarms triggered, their high-pitched wailing cutting through the sound of straining metal. The viewport in front of me developed a spider web of hairline cracks that hadn't been there seconds ago. Hull breach detected in sections 3 and 4, the automated system announced in its flat, computerized voice. Hull integrity at 68% and dropping. Emergency protocols engaged. I pulled myself back into the pilot seat, hands flying across the controls. The pressure readout was climbing fast. That thing's teeth had punched clean through our exterior plating, and water was starting to force its way in. Small jets of mist sprayed from newly formed cracks along the cabin's ceiling. "Come on, come on," I muttered, pulling up the damage assessment screen. The 3D model of the Explorer showed multiple puncture points clustered around the forward section. The emergency bulkheads had automatically sealed, but they weren't designed for this kind of damage. We were taking on water fast. The depth gauge now read 7,250 feet. We were sinking faster than before. I grabbed the edge of the console as the submersible lurched again, the creature's massive body thrashing outside. Through the cracked viewport, I caught a glimpse of its eye, black, cold, and fixed directly on me. Its jaws remained clamped around the hull, those prehistoric teeth embedded in the Explorer's skin like massive fishhooks. And that's when it hit me. The creature wasn't letting go. It had us firmly in its grip. But in doing so, it had committed to us. It was stuck. I looked back at the controls, specifically at the Salvage harpoon system. 2 harpoons designed for securing and retrieving deep-sea wreckage. Each one fired a barbed projectile attached to a reinforced carbon fiber cable with a 5-ton tensile strength. They weren't weapons. They were tools. But right now, they might be my only option. I quickly brought the targeting system online, using the external cameras that were still functioning to get a clear view of the creature. Its massive body filled the screens, scales glinting in the Explorer's dying external lights. Its jaws were locked onto the submersible's forward section, muscles tensed as it tried to tear through the hull. Perfect. I aimed the first harpoon at the thick muscle where its jaw met its neck. The targeting reticle glowed green, confirming a lock. "Let's see how you like this," I said, slamming my palm onto the firing control. The cabin shuddered as the first harpoon fired with a hydraulic hiss. On the screen, I watched the barbed projectile punch deep into the creature's flesh. Dark blood billowed out into the water as the cable went taut. The creature's reaction was immediate and violent. Its entire body convulsed, thrashing wildly against the unexpected pain. The Explorer spun sickeningly, and I grabbed the seat restraints to keep from being thrown across the cabin. But the creature couldn't let go. The harpoon had done its job, anchoring it to us even as its jaws remained locked on our hull. I fought the nausea from the spinning and lined up the second shot, this time aiming for the opposite side of its neck. Another green lock confirmation, another press of the firing control. The second harpoon shot out and buried itself in the creature's flesh. Now the beast was doubly tethered to us, by its own jaws, and by 2 industrial harpoons designed to haul multi-ton wreckage. The Explorer lurched again as the creature redoubled its efforts to break free. The motion sent me slamming back against my seat, and I tasted blood where I'd bitten my tongue. Water was now spraying steadily from several points in the ceiling, pooling on the floor of the cabin. The electrical systems sparked and sputtered as seawater reached them. I checked the depth gauge, 7,300 feet, and dropping faster now. The creature's frantic movements were actually accelerating our descent. Every thrash and twist dragged us deeper into the trench. "Hull integrity at 52%, the system announced, its voice cutting in and out as the electrical systems failed. Critical failure imminent." The lights flickered, plunging the cabin into momentary darkness before the emergency backup kicked in, bathing everything in a dull red glow. Through the viewport, I could still see the creature, its eye now wide with what looked strangely like panic. We passed 7,400 feet, then 7,450. The submersible groaned under the increasing pressure. More cracks appeared in the viewport, and the spray of water from the ceiling became a steady stream. At this rate, we had minutes at most before catastrophic failure. But something else was happening. The creature's movements were changing. No longer the calculated attacks of a predator, they'd become frantic, almost desperate. Its massive body twisted and pulled, not just trying to tear apart the explorer, but seemingly attempting to drag us upward. That's when I realized it needed to breathe. This wasn't some supernatural monster or alien creature. Despite its prehistoric appearance, it was still an air-breathing marine reptile. And we were now well below the depth where even this evolutionary marvel could comfortably operate. It needed to surface, and it needed to do it soon. But it couldn't break free of the harpoons, and its jaws were still locked onto our hull. We were trapped together in a deadly embrace, sinking ever deeper into the abyss. 7,500 feet flashed on the depth gauge. The hull creaked ominously, metal stress points howling under pressure never meant to withstand. Water was ankle-deep on the floor now, icy cold and rising fast. "Warning! Hull collapse estimated in 3 minutes," the system informed me, its voice distorting as water damaged more systems. I watched the creature through the viewport. Its eye rolled wildly, its body contorting in increasingly erratic movements. It was running out of oxygen, just like I soon would when the hull finally gave way. But unlike me, it had a chance if it could reach the surface, and that's when the plan formed in my mind. A desperate, probably suicidal plan, but the only option I had left. If the creature needed air badly enough, maybe, just maybe, its survival instinct would be stronger than its hunting instinct. Maybe I could use its need to breathe as our ticket out of this death trap. I looked at the harpoon controls, then at the emergency ejection system that was still, miraculously, showing green. The escape pod was designed to shoot to the surface from depths of up to 7,000 feet. We were already past that safety margin, but it was the only chance I had. The creature needed to go up. I needed to go up. And right now, we were linked together by 2 industrial-strength harpoon cables. I just had to convince it that we both wanted the same thing. The depth gauge hit 7,800 feet, and the hull of the Mariana Explorer creaked around me like an old ship in a storm. I stared at the digital readout, watching those numbers that shouldn't keep climbing but were. Each foot deeper brought us closer to the Explorer's absolute crush depth, the point where physics would win the argument with engineering. I looked through the cracked viewport at the creature still clamped to our hull. Its movements had changed. Gone was the calculated hunting behavior. Now it thrashed with increasingly erratic motions, its massive body twisting against the 2 harpoon cables that kept it tethered to us. Its eye rolled wildly when it passed the viewport, revealing something I hadn't seen before: panic. Pure animal panic. "You know what's happening too, don't you?" I said out loud, my voice sounding strange in the cabin filled with alarm tones and the spray of water leaking through compromised seals. "We're both running out of time." The hull gave another low groan that vibrated through my feet. The automatic system chimed in with its too calm voice. "Warning, hull integrity at 54%, approaching maximum rated depth." The creature and I were locked in a deadly embrace. We were sinking together into depths that would kill us both. A modern submarine and an animal that shouldn't exist, united in our imminent destruction. The pressure at this depth was crushing, over 3 tons per square inch. Eventually it would find every weakness. I pulled up the emergency ejection sequence on the main console, my fingers hovering over the keys. The escape pod was my last option, a reinforced capsule designed to detach from the main vessel and rocket to the surface using compressed gas. But I hesitated, my mind racing through calculations. The creature was still firmly attached to the Explorer by the two harpoon cables. If I ejected now, the physics were simple and brutal. The pod would try to ascend, but the weight of both the creature and the submersible would either prevent it from rising at all or tear the pod apart when the cables went taut. Either way, I'd be dead. I needed to detach the harpoons first. "Think, Sully," I muttered, running a hand over my face. 15 years of deep-sea operations had taught me to solve problems under pressure, though never quite this literally. I pulled up the harpoon system controls and found the emergency release mechanism. It was designed to cut the cables in case they became entangled in underwater debris. I diverted power from the remaining life support systems, watching as the available energy for the release mechanism climbed to full capacity. The creature smashed against the hull again, weaker this time. The impact barely registered compared to its earlier attacks. The pressure was affecting it too. Even a prehistoric monster had its limits. Its eye passed the viewport again, and I could see the panic had turned to something else. A dulling. The pressure was winning. I looked at the depth gauge. 7,150 feet. My finger hovered over the release control. Then I pulled it back. A new plan formed in my mind. Desperate, risky, but possibly our only chance. If I fully released the harpoons, the creature would separate from us completely. We'd continue sinking while it might be able to swim away, or more likely, it would keep attacking until we both died. But if I could time it just right. I adjusted the release mechanism, deliberately setting it to stop at 80% completion, enough to weaken the connection without severing it completely. Then I hit the button. The mechanism whirred to life. On the external camera feeds, I could see the cable housing shifting, the tension changing as the system prepared to release. The progress bar on screen climbed, 20%, 40%, 60%, 70%. At 80%, I cut the power. The system froze, exactly as I'd planned. The harpoons remained embedded in the creature, but the cables were now prepped for quick release, hanging by a thread. "Warning, hull integrity at 47%, the system announced. Depth, 7,880 feet. I turned to the ejection system and began the final sequence. My fingers moved deliberately across the control panel, entering the codes and preparing the escape pod for emergency ascent. The pod's systems came online, its separate power supply showing full capacity. On the external cameras, I could see the creature moving less vigorously now. Its massive body still fought against the harpoon cables, but its movements were sluggish, weakening under the extreme pressure. Even a beast that had survived for millions of years couldn't withstand these depths for long. My plan was simple but precarious. Wait until we reached near crush depth, then trigger both the final harpoon release and the escape pod ejection simultaneously. The timing had to be perfect. Too soon, and the creature might still have the strength to drag us down. Too late, and we'd both be crushed by the pressure. The depth gauge ticked to 7,900 feet. I positioned my hands over the dual controls, left hand on the harpoon release override, right hand on the ejection trigger. The hull creaked loudly, metal stress echoing through the cabin like a dying animal's cry. Warning, hull integrity at 39%, critical breach imminent. Water was now spraying steadily from multiple points in the ceiling and walls, pooling on the floor of the cabin. The viewport had a spiderweb of cracks spreading slowly across its surface. I knew I had seconds, not minutes. The creature's eye passed the viewport one last time. It was dull now, barely moving. The prehistoric beast finally succumbing to pressures it was never meant to experience. For a moment I felt a strange connection to it. Two beings from different worlds, different times, facing death together in the crushing dark. The depth gauge hit 7,920 feet. The hull gave a loud crack that echoed through the cabin. "Critical hull failure in 10 seconds," the system warned. I took one deep breath and steadied my hands over the controls. The next few seconds would determine whether I lived or died. I pressed both buttons simultaneously, and the world around me exploded into chaos. The depth gauge ticked past 8,000 feet. We were now officially beyond the Explorer's maximum rated depth. The crushing pressure at this level would eventually overwhelm even the most robust deep-sea vessel, and the Mariana Explorer wasn't the most robust, just the most affordable option Pacific Salvage Operations could lease for this mission. I wiped sweat from my forehead with my sleeve and returned to the partially completed escape sequence on the main console. My injured shoulder throbbed, but I couldn't spare attention for the pain. The digital readouts told a grim story. Hull integrity at 42% and falling. Life support systems still functional but compromised. Ballast systems non-responsive. Through the external camera feed, I could see the creature was still tethered to us by the 2 harpoon cables, though its movements had grown noticeably weaker. Its massive body jerked sporadically instead of the powerful thrashing from before. The pressure at this depth was clearly affecting it. Even a prehistoric beast had limits. "Not so tough now, are you?" I muttered, then caught myself. Talking to sea monsters was probably a bad sign. "Focus, Fox." A soft cracking sound drew my attention to the main viewport. Hairline fractures had begun to form at the edges, spreading inward like a spider's web being spun in slow motion. My stomach dropped. Once those fractures connected, the viewport would fail catastrophically, and no human body could withstand the pressure that would follow. I punched commands into the auxiliary systems panel, rerouting emergency power to the cockpit reinforcement shields. They weren't designed for this scenario, more for impact protection than pressure resistance, but they might buy me the extra minutes needed to complete the escape sequence. "Diverting power from sections 3 through 7 to cockpit reinforcement," I said aloud, the sound of my voice oddly comforting in the creaking, groaning cabin. The lights dimmed momentarily as power shifted, then stabilized at a lower intensity. The reinforcement shields hummed to life, metal plates sliding into position around the interior of the cockpit. They wouldn't stop the eventual collapse, but they'd ensure the main hull failed first, giving the escape pod, essentially the cockpit section of the Explorer, a chance to detach before being crushed. The depth gauge now read 8,100 feet. I turned back to the escape pod launch sequence, fingers moving across the keypad with practiced efficiency. 15 years of deep-sea salvage operations had trained my hands to work independently of the fear in my mind. A violent jerk shook the entire submersible, throwing me against the control panel. My already injured shoulder hit hard, and I bit back a cry of pain. The creature had made a sudden, powerful movement. Perhaps its death throes. Warning alarms blared, and the main console sparked and went dark. Several auxiliary screens followed, leaving the cabin bathed primarily in the red emergency lighting. "No, no, no," I hissed, scanning the remaining functional displays. The ejection system was now showing multiple circuit failures. The automated launch sequence I'd been programming was corrupted. The safety protocols wouldn't allow completion with this level of system damage. I had to switch to manual override, but that meant physically rewiring the ejection controls to bypass the damaged circuits. My hands were already moving to the maintenance panel below the main console, pulling it open to reveal the tangle of wiring beneath. The depth gauge clicked to 8,150 feet. Water began to seep through the hairline cracks in the viewport, first as a fine mist that beaded on the interior surface, then as small, steady streams that pooled on the floor. The temperature in the cabin dropped as the frigid deep-sea water invaded our space. I located the primary ejection control relay, a rectangular black box connected to multiple wire bundles. 3 of the 6 connection points had clearly been damaged by the power surge. Working quickly, I pulled spare wiring from the emergency toolkit stored beneath the pilot's seat and began to create bypass connections. Ejection power needs to route through auxiliary systems, I reminded myself, tracing the circuitry with my fingers. Green to yellow bypass for power, blue to red for the ignition sequence. The hull groaned around me, a deep, ominous sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. Metal under this kind of pressure doesn't just break, it fails all at once, catastrophically. The depth gauge read 8 out of 200 feet. More water sprayed through the viewport cracks, creating a constant cold mist in the cabin. The floor was now covered with an inch of water that sloshed with every movement of the submersible. Through the still functioning external camera, I caught movement from the creature. Its massive body convulsed, and then, incredibly, its jaws released their grip on the explorer's hull. But the harpoons remained embedded in its flesh, keeping us tethered to the dying beast. We were still being dragged deeper by its weight. My fingers, now numb from the cold, continued to work with the wiring. I spliced the final connection, completing the manual override circuit. Water dripped onto the exposed wires, causing small sparks, but the connections held. I could feel the pressure now, even inside the reinforced cockpit. My ears popped painfully, and it felt like a weight was pressing on my chest, making each breath harder than the last. The hull wouldn't hold much longer, maybe seconds. With steady hands that belied my racing heart, I closed the maintenance panel and reached for the manual ejection switch I'd just rewired. One final check of the external camera showed the creature, still attached by the harpoons, its eye now dull and unfocused. "Here's hoping, you prehistoric bastard," I muttered, pressing the final activation button. For one heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. A heartbeat passed. Then another. The manual ejection switch seemed dead under my fingers. Then it happened. I felt a violent jerk as the explosive bolts finally detonated. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, like shotgun blasts, inches from my ears. My injured shoulder slammed against the control panel as the entire cockpit module tore away from the main body of the Mariana Explorer. The emergency thrusters fired with no warning, hitting me with a force that knocked the wind from my lungs. My body crushed back against the seat as the escape pod shot upward. The acceleration was brutal, like being kicked in the chest by a horse. My vision narrowed to a pinpoint, then widened again as I fought to stay conscious. Water sloshed around my feet, still leaking through the damaged viewport but at a slower rate now. The sudden change in momentum had thrown most of it against the rear wall. I gripped the edge of the console with my good arm, trying to stabilize myself as the pod rocketed toward the surface. Through the small viewport in the pod's base, I could see the main body of the Explorer. The massive submersible, with the prehistoric monster still attached by the harpoons, continued its fatal descent into the abyss. The floodlights on the pod cast just enough illumination to make out its shape disappearing into the blackness below. The creature's movements had grown sluggish, its massive body now barely twitching as the weight of the submersible pulled it deeper. I checked the depth gauge. 350 feet and rising. No, not rising. We were decreasing in depth, ascending. The numbers were changing faster than I'd ever seen them move. The emergency thrusters were doing their job, burning through fuel at an alarming rate to counteract the crushing pressure and our own weight. My ears popped painfully as the pressure began to change. I swallowed hard, trying to equalize. The escape pod wasn't designed for comfort, just survival. Its reinforced hull could withstand the pressure, but the rapid ascent created its own dangers. I looked down once more. The Explorer and the creature were still faintly visible, now tiny in the distance. As they passed 8,500 feet, I watched the creature's struggles cease completely. Even its prehistoric body had limits, and we'd gone well beyond what it could withstand. The massive weight of the submersible would ensure that neither it nor the creature would ever return to the surface. They would continue down. They would continue down to the bottom of the trench, becoming part of the seafloor, buried in silt and forgotten. The thought gave me a strange sense of closure. I turned my attention to the pod systems, bringing up the main status display. The readouts flickered in and out. Damage from the rapid detachment had affected some of the electronics. I tapped the screen, trying to get a steady reading. Oxygen levels, 78% and fluctuating. Ascent rate, 60 feet per second. Hull integrity, 89%. Power, 65% and dropping. Not ideal, but I was alive. For now. The rapid pressure change made my head swim. My ears continued to pop painfully, and I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with fear. I'd done emergency ascents in training, but never from such an extreme depth, and never in a damaged pod. The human body isn't meant to experience such rapid decompression. I tried to control my breathing. Too fast, and I'd risk passing out from oxygen deprivation. Too slow, and I wouldn't get enough as the cabin pressure changed. The oxygen levels dipped to 75%, then 73%. Something was wrong with the life support system. "Come on," I muttered, voice sounding strange in my own ears. "Just hold together." I hit the emergency oxygen release, and a burst of fresh air flooded the cabin. The reading stabilized temporarily at 80%, but I knew it was a short-term fix. The system was damaged, and I had limited backup oxygen. My vision blurred as we passed 6,000 feet. The readout showed our ascent rate had increased to 70 feet per second. Too fast for safety, but I had no way to slow us down. The emergency thrusters were designed for one thing: getting to the surface as quickly as possible. Finesse wasn't part of the equation. I checked the external temperature gauge. It was rising as we approached shallower waters. The pod groaned as it adjusted to the changing pressure. The water on the floor had stopped increasing. The leak was either sealed by the changing pressure, or we'd outrun the worst of it. At 5,000 feet, I felt blood trickle from my nose. Rapid decompression was taking its toll. I wiped it away with the back of my hand, leaving a red smear on my sleeve. My shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, but that pain was almost welcome. It kept me alert. The depth gauge continued its rapid count. 4,500, 4,000, 3,500. I noticed the pod's ascent beginning to slow. The readout confirmed my fears. The primary thruster was losing power. The emergency fuel cells were depleting faster than they should. At 3,000 feet, the primary thruster sputtered out completely. Our ascent rate dropped dramatically, from 70 feet per second to less than 20. The pod shuddered as the main propulsion died, leaving us rising on buoyancy alone. It wouldn't be enough. The damage to the ballast system meant we didn't have the positive buoyancy needed to reach the surface. No, no, no. I fought against the wave of panic rising in my chest. I was too close to die now. I accessed the secondary systems panel and located the emergency booster controls. These were meant to be a last resort, small, high-intensity rockets that could provide short bursts of thrust. They weren't designed for sustained use, but I had no choice. I manually fired the first booster. The pod lurched upward, ascending rate jumping back to 40 feet per second. I watched the fuel gauge on the secondary system tick down rapidly. Each booster would only last about 15 seconds before burning out. When the first booster died, I counted to 5, watching our ascent slow again, then fired the second. Another jolt upward. I developed a rhythm. Fire, count, wait, fire again. Each time, the pod jumped toward the surface, then slowed as the booster burned out. The oxygen level had stabilized at 65%, enough to keep me conscious, but the air was getting thinner. My head pounded, and my thoughts felt sluggish. At 2,500 feet, I began to see light filtering down from the surface. Actual sunlight, not the artificial glare of the pod's external lamps. I'd never seen anything so beautiful. 1,000 feet. I had 3 boosters left. 500 feet. 2 boosters. 200 feet. 1 booster. I saved the final booster for the last push. At 50 feet, I fired it, and the pod surged upward. After nearly an hour of tense monitoring and manual adjustments, we finally breached the surface with a splash that rocked the tiny craft. Sunlight flooded through the viewport, blindingly bright after the darkness of the deep. The pod bobbed on the surface, rocking with the ocean swells. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up from my chest. I was alive. I reached for the communication panel and activated the automatic locator beacon, my fingers clumsy with exhaustion. The screen lit up, showing a steady signal transmitting our position. Someone would find me. It might take hours, but they would come. I confirmed the beacon was transmitting, then collapsed against the control panel, physically and mentally exhausted but alive. The gentle rocking of the pod on the ocean waves was the most comforting sensation I'd ever felt. 2 hours had passed since the escape pod breached the surface. I floated alone on the vast Pacific, my body still adjusting to the pressure change. The throbbing in my shoulder had settled into a dull, persistent ache, and I'd managed to stop my nosebleed by pinching the bridge of my nose with the corner of my shirt. The pod bobbed gently with each passing wave, its stabilization system keeping it from capsizing despite the ocean's restless motion. I scanned the horizon for what felt like the 100th time. The emergency beacon had been transmitting since I'd surfaced, but in these remote waters, help could take hours to arrive. The sun beat down on the pod's exterior, turning the small cabin into something approaching an oven. I'd cracked the top hatch for ventilation, careful not to open it too wide in case a sudden wave sent water rushing in. A glint of metal caught my eye in the distance. I pulled myself up to get a better look, wincing as my injured shoulder protested. There it was, unmistakable on the horizon, the silhouette of a ship growing larger by the minute. I recognized the profile immediately. The Horizon Seeker. Pacific Salvage Operations' primary recovery vessel. Relief washed over me in a wave more powerful than any that had rocked the pod since I'd surfaced. As the ship drew closer, I could make out figures moving on the deck. Someone was waving. I waved back with my good arm, feeling a smile crack my salt-crusted lips. The Horizon Seeker slowed as it approached, careful not to create a wake that might destabilize the pod. I watched as they lowered a recovery boat from the starboard side. 3 crew members climbed aboard, and the small craft motored toward me with purpose. When they pulled alongside the pod, I recognized Captain Jacob Howard standing at the bow. His imposing frame blocked the sun as he looked down at me. "Fox, you look like hell," he called out, his deep voice carrying easily over the water. "Good to see you too, Captain," I replied, my voice rough from dehydration. Jacob supervised as his crew secured lines to the pod to prevent it from drifting away. Then he climbed over the side himself, his heavy boots landing on the pod's outer hull with a solid thunk. He crouched down beside the hatch and peered inside. "Can you climb out, or do you need assistance?" he asked, his eyes quickly assessing my condition. "I can manage," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. My legs felt like rubber after hours cramped in the pilot's seat, and my injured shoulder made climbing tricky. I grabbed the edge of the hatch with my good hand and pulled myself up. The moment I tried to put weight on my arm, pain shot through my shoulder and I faltered. Jacob's strong hands immediately caught me under my arms. "I got you," he said, his grip firm but careful. With Jacob's help, I emerged from the pod into the blinding sunlight. The fresh air hit my lungs, and I took deep breaths, savoring the sensation after hours of recycled oxygen. Left shoulder's busted, I explained, as Jacob helped me over to the recovery boat. Medical will check you out once we get you aboard, he replied, easing me down into a seat. The crew worked quickly to secure the escape pod for retrieval. Jacob sat beside me as we motored back to the Horizon Seeker. Neither of us spoke during the short journey. I was too exhausted, and Jacob knew better than to press for details before I was ready. Boarding the Horizon Seeker proved challenging with my injury. A hydraulic lift raised our boat level with the main deck, where more crew members waited. Jacob helped me step onto the deck, and I felt a rush of gratitude for solid, stable flooring beneath my feet. Jacob guided me to a cargo crate where I could sit. He disappeared briefly and returned with a thermal blanket, which he draped around my shoulders. The silver material crinkled as I pulled it tighter, suddenly aware of how cold I felt despite the warm day. "What happened down there, Fox?" Jacob asked, his voice quieter now, meant only for my ears. "We lost contact with you at around 6,000 feet. Then, nothing for hours until your emergency beacon activated." Before I could answer, a crew member approached with a steaming mug. I accepted it with a nod of thanks and took a careful sip. The coffee was strong and sweet, exactly what I needed. The warmth spread through my chest, helping to ground me in the present moment. "The Explorer's gone," I said after a long pause, my eyes fixed on the dark liquid in my mug. "Complete loss." Jacob exhaled slowly. "Jeff's not going to like that. That's a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment." "I know," I replied. The coffee burned my throat, but I welcomed the sensation. It was real, immediate, unlike the surreal nightmare I'd experienced in the depths. I shifted my position, trying to find a comfortable way to sit that didn't aggravate my shoulder. The ship's medical officer had given me a quick once-over and confirmed nothing was broken, just badly strained. He'd wrapped it and given me something for the pain, but it would be days before I could use it properly. From my seat on the deck, I had a clear view of the ocean stretching to the horizon in all directions. The water looked peaceful from up here, beautiful even, with the afternoon sun casting golden reflections across its surface. Hard to believe that miles below that serene blue expanse lurked something that shouldn't exist. The pliosaur. Even now, sitting safely on the deck of the Horizon Seeker, I could picture it clearly. The massive jaws clamping onto the Explorer's hull, the ancient eye regarding me through the viewport, the impossible reality of a creature that should have been extinct for over 100 million years. And now, the evidence lay scattered across the ocean floor, more than 8,000 feet below us. The Explorer's crushed hull, the harpoons, and perhaps the creature itself, returned to the depths from which it never should have emerged. "Fox." Jacob's voice pulled me from my thoughts. He was watching me with concern. "You've been staring at that water for 5 minutes straight. What happened down there?" I took another sip of coffee, buying myself time to think. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen? The footage had been stored in the Explorer's main databanks, lost forever when the submersible imploded. All that remained were my own recollections and the limited sensor data I'd managed to save to the emergency drive. Without evidence, who would believe my account of a living prehistoric marine reptile? Even Jacob, who respected my experience and judgment, would have trouble accepting such a claim, and Jeff Schmidt, with his focus on the bottom line, would likely see it as an attempt to deflect blame for the loss of expensive equipment. I looked up at Jacob, who was still waiting patiently for an answer. "System failure," I said finally, near what I think was an underwater volcanic vent. The Explorer's cooling systems couldn't compensate for the sudden temperature change. By the time I realized what was happening, we were already taking on water and sinking past the crush depth. The lie tasted bitter in my mouth, but it was more believable than the truth. Jacob nodded slowly, accepting the explanation. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "Not many people survive a deep-sea emergency ejection." "Yeah," I agreed quietly. "Lucky." The ship's engines changed pitch, and I felt the subtle shift as the Horizon Seeker altered course. We were heading home. Jacob stood up, placing a hand briefly on my good shoulder. "Get some rest, Fox. We'll be back at base in about 14 hours. Medical wants you to stop by the infirmary once you're finished with that coffee." I nodded, and Jacob left me to my thoughts. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in deepening shades of orange and pink. I watched the colors change, trying to find comfort in the familiar beauty of a Pacific sunset. My thoughts turned to Jeff Schmidt and our inevitable debriefing when we reached base. Jeff wasn't just my employer. He was a shrewd businessman who had built Pacific salvage operations from the ground up. He valued the truth, but he also valued his company's reputation and financial stability. How would he react to a story about prehistoric creatures in the deep? Would he dismiss it outright? Or worse, would he believe me and then seek to exploit the discovery? My free hand moved to the pocket of my still damp coveralls, feeling the hard outline of the emergency data drive I'd retrieved from the escape pod systems before being helped aboard. The drive contained sensor readings from the Explorer's final moments, pressure anomalies, impact force measurements, sonar imaging that showed something massive moving at depths where nothing that size should exist. Not definitive proof, perhaps, but enough to show that something truly extraordinary had happened in the depths of the Tonga Trench. I wasn't sure yet what I would tell Jeff, but as I watched the sunset over the Pacific, I knew the decision would shape not just my future, but potentially our understanding of what still lurked in Earth's most unexplored frontier.